Okay, good afternoon. Today we're going to look at how the public are programmed, how it drives behaviour. This is part 2 in the series, and part 1 was last week, and you can watch that on replay. In fact, after this, it's not essential to know before this one. So, introduction of today. What is Reaching People? Reaching People is a project that really looks at how we can have good conversations with people, and obviously over the last 2 years, we've seen how they've been very strained and very problematic. There is a way to get through to people, but it's not easy. It's almost like an obstacle course to have a good, open and honest conversation. We also look at how to message effectively, how to understand what message will land, and how we can really promote people to act in better ways. And the third part of the project, in particular, what we're going to look at today is behavior and how we are influenced. It's so key. If we don't know this, we can't protect ourselves from undue influence. We can't positively influence well, and we can't stop some of the problematic influence that's going on. So a few notes about today. We have got very limited resources and therefore graphics, etc. It's really about getting the information out there. That's really what our goal is. And today we're going to look at a key metaphor. This is going to allow us to understand how programming works and why people act the way they do. Without this information, it really is very difficult. It's like searching around in the dark. So I think this metaphor is going to be very powerful. It's going to allow you to understand things. Once we understand things, then we can work with it obviously a lot more effectively. So just a quick summary of part 1, where what it was, we looked at what is conditioning, and really conditioning is really learning. How do people learn things? How do people learn that one virus is dangerous, but another one is not dangerous? Really, so much of it comes from propaganda, education, and many other means. There's 2 main forms of conditioning. There's classical and operant. And this really is how the GPS of our mind is programmed. And that's what we're going to look at a lot today, is this GPS. So I'd highly recommend watching the video on conditioning, the classical and operant, but it's not absolutely essential to understand today. And really, we looked at last week how they were used. That's how these conditionings were used to create this only way out scenario. So there was just one product that everyone was shuffled towards. And that's what we looked at last week. So today, we're going to look at the vehicle metaphor, which is the driver, the passenger, and the GPS. Understanding these 3 aspects of our mind is going to give us a much greater understanding of what drives people's behavior. We're going to look at 10 key points to understand how the mind is programmed and how it works. And we're going to look at an important point, resolutions. So this vehicle metaphor. Understanding the human mind. So we have Joe, who's our classic character, and Joe really goes along with the narrative. And really, we want to understand why. Joe's a clever guy. You know, he has a degree in mathematics, but he tends to follow narratives. He doesn't question authority, and he finds himself really just complying with many requests. He considers himself a critical thinking guy, but obviously, objectively, we would question that. So if we look into Joe's mind, and we sort of label parts of his mind, and we say that there's a thinker, which is the rational part of the mind, when he's conscious of things. There's a gorilla, so there's this animal part of the mind. Some people have mouse, some people have gorillas, some people have Godzilla, but it's that part of us that's really to trigger in and protect us. So really, this part of the mind is scanning the environment for a threat or an opportunity to really alert us, right, we need to look at this. If there's a real big danger, it will shut down that thinking part of the mind and just operate automatically to protect us. And that's why fear is such the currency of control, because once the fear kicks in, that rational parts of the mind shut down, and then the person really goes on autopilot. And then this is the key part that we're going to look at, which is the GPS system. What is the GPS system? It's effectively all the knowledge that we understand. It's all the reservoir of memories, information. How do we know that blue is green and green? It's held in the GPS. How do we know that 2 + 2 = 4? It's held in the GPS. So the GPS is really the storehouse of our knowledge. There's so much more in there. There's like our self-image, you know, why people are apathetic, all those things, that's all stored in the sat-nav as well. So what happens is, with the vehicle, we effectively are in a car. The rational mind is the driver. The animal part of the mind, the gorilla, is the passenger. Okay, and the GPS really is what we both the conscious and the unconscious mind, will use to determine where it is we want to go. Now, this is one of those special cars that actually has 2 steering wheels and 2 sets of pedals. Now, the passenger, which is that gorilla part of the mind, can shut down or take over at any point. And this is why fear is such a powerful motivator, because you could be very conscious and all of a sudden, you know, if you had a phobia of snakes, for instance, and a snake turns up, the rational mind shuts down and you go onto the unconscious mind. So that passenger at any point can put the brakes on. We've all seen this in a conversation where you'll be talking to someone and you will say something that they perceive as a threat to either their person or their ego, and they will turn into an animal and they will shut down. This is such a common thing that we will see. You'll often see anger, because anger is one of these tendencies to lash out. And people become angry at you when they perceive that you are threatening their safety in any way. And it could be ego safety as well. So when we look at like the gorilla, the classic one is the public speaking, because that's one of the #1 phobias, is that if you have a phobia of public speaking, the conscious mind in this vehicle will want to drive to get up on stage and speak. But in the GPS, it says public speaking is dangerous. The gorilla will take the wheel and it will drive you to avoid it. Anytime you have a phobia, that's generally what happens, is that the gorilla will take over and it will drive you to safety, i.e. avoiding that thing that you have a phobia of. How do you know you have a phobia of it? Because that information is in the GPS. So hopefully with this simple vehicle metaphor, you can start to see that we're not always in conscious control of ourselves. And this is why so much fear, propaganda, all these things really focus on the emotions, because they can get people to act in a way that they normally wouldn't act, because they wouldn't be in a rational state of mind. So #2 is when the passenger takes over, the rational mind is mostly shut down and you usually cannot override this. So the amount of times that someone said to me, I know what to say, then I get angry or I get emotional and I can't remember a thing. That isn't personal to you. That is how the brain works, because the gorilla has taken over. And because the gorilla needs all the resources to protect you, it shuts down the rational mind. So it's effectively taking control and the rational mind has no say what's going on. So really what happens is, you know, you want to stay rational, but of course, when you get emotional, that gorilla is going to overtake and it's going to drive the car down to the pathway to get emotional. And you pretty much will lose the ability to stay rational. There is a way to override this. There is a way to reprogram this. It's not easy, but it's certainly possible. #3, the car self-drives itself based on the GPS 95% of the time. So much of our behavior is automatic. So what's in the GPS is really what's going on. So because so many people have been so conditioned from before they could walk to obey authority and not question it, you're going to see that as not a conscious behavior. It's just going to be something that's automatic. And you see this often, that if you miss your turn off, what's gone on there is that your unconscious mind has just gone into autopilot, driving along, and you've realized you might be going somewhere different from normal. And what happens is that you just end up in that new place. Now, we are very much creatures of habit. Now, it's my opinion that our ability to reprogram the GPS and become very conscious of these things is really the power that we have in the conscious mind. #4, both the driver and the passenger get the information from the sat-nav, what's in this GPS. So the GPS is so key, and we can give a classic example of a quote when Voltaire said, "If you can convince me of absurdities, I can commit atrocities." This is whatever people think to be true really governs their behavior. That's why whatever's in this GPS, and there can be times when the conscious and the unconscious mind are accessing different data in the GPS. That's certainly possible. A classic example of getting bad data in the GPS is the mask data. So, if you believe that masks are safe and they protect you, then you would wear one. If you then see someone that wasn't wearing one, that would signal a trigger to your safety, and that's when the gorilla would kick in. That's why you see these videos on the internet of people being absolutely abusive to someone not wearing a mask, because to that person, it's a signal of threat. You know, they really think that they're having their safety threatened by this person. Okay, yes, so when it comes to masks, this is why people would react so aggressively if you weren't wearing one. And of course, to try and rationally talk to someone about this is futile a lot of the time, because what's in the GPS has been placed there, and anyone that questions that has been obviously called a denier, etc. So masks are one of the most problematic purely because of the emotions around it. So what you'll generally have is that people will be moving towards wear mask or do not wear based on what's in that GPS. Number 5, our self-image also resides in the GPS. Now, this really is one of the things that goes above most people's awareness, and it's so key. Because what you find is that when you finally get through to a lot of people, constantly you'll hear this, well, what can I do? And it's really, what can I do, said 7 billion people. Now, I think the thing that most people overlook is that where does that thought come from? That thought comes from basically the self-image that's been conditioned into us through our education system. This is so key. And this really is one of the ways where, because so many people are passive, and with knowledge of this and understanding, we really should be striving to program ourselves to have, you know, utmost confidence and really to let go of any of those things that, you know, stop us from challenging authority and these other things. It's relatively straightforward to reprogram the GPS around, you know, question authority. Number 6, we overestimate how much conscious control we have over our behavior. So think about anything you cannot resist. And I bet you imagine that next time you can resist it, such as chocolate or your favorite cake, all these things, we succumb when our willpower is not strong. And then we somehow imagine next time we're going to be able to have conscious control. I think it's really worth understanding what's driving this, because a lot of, such as the chocolate one, is actually relatively straightforward to resolve with the right technologies. Okay, so again, when it comes to chocolate, no chocolate, consciously you'd be driving to the no chocolate if you wanted to avoid it, but sooner or later the gorilla is going to take over, or you're going to be on autopilot. So number 7, the harmony illusion. This is really a fascinating one. And really, it's once this GPS is updated with new information, the whole system often updates quickly. And what you'll find is that many people will say, oh, I always believe that, or I critically think. So the information will come out to prove that one of the things that we were told is true is not true, and then everyone will suddenly change their mind and pretend that's what they always think, because the mind always wants to sort of think that it's there's this kind of self-serving bias that goes on. This is where you see an awful lot of hypocrisy, and it's not intentional on many people's parts. They truly think, you know, the brain's kind of tricking them in many respects. And then, of course, we come to number 8, which is really fascinating. And of course, it's one of those funny ones. On the left, look into new information and possibly accept we've been making poor decisions, or ignore the new information and fall, you know, in favor of bad habits. So the mind dislikes dissonance and will look to resolve it quickly. So whenever there's a disconnect, say there's 2 bits of information in the GPS that don't match, or parts of information around, we don't like them, we try and resolve it. And of course, what happened during the pandemic is this was actually weaponized. This is why they said, if you don't do X, Y, Z, you're selfish. So they're actually creating dissonance where we don't want to look selfish. So often a lot of people will change their behavior. That was very much a lot of pressure for people, was their public acceptance. And of course, another thing of dissonance is that we would have seen that, you know, somebody got a procedure to protect them from something, it didn't protect them from it. So they had 2 choices: to decide it didn't work, which didn't feel good, or actually to rationalize it would have been much worse. So what you would have found is that the whole car would have driven up to, oh, it would have been much worse, because that allows them to keep the self-image intact. Then what we have is a very interesting thing. This really sort of confused me for many years when I was working with phobias and helping people with problems, is that the conscious and the unconscious often block solutions. And then I can work this out, and then it actually becomes straightforward that, as the spider example, phobia example of spiders, in the conscious mind knows it's scared of spiders because it moves away from them. In the UK, it will also know that it shouldn't be scared of spiders, but that doesn't stop the person being scared of spiders. So what happens is, anytime you mention, we could get rid of that phobia for you, the animal will kick in, the gorilla, and say, no way, because that phobia protects the person from being exposed to something that's dangerous to them. So in effect, we get caught in a loop. Whereas even if you consciously know that that thing, is not dangerous, because of the unconscious and the GPS, it will resist you changing. And this, a lot of the time, is why changing the mind and changing the way we see problems is so problematic, because we're often tripping ourselves up. And this is why it's really important to understand this point. So really, when it comes to often someone taking away the fear, most people actually don't want to lose their fear because they're caught in a loop. Once you're aware of this and you can actually process the fear, then you can release so many of these emotions. But so much of the mind is actually trying to move towards keeping status quo. And then what we've got is 10, which is really, really key. A lot of the GPS is actually outside of our awareness, and some of it is repressed or even denied. And the classic example is the park example. And I mean, there's so many examples we've listed on the project. But Danny Shine actually went into there's a picture of Hyde Park. And he went into Hyde Park and he had a tannoy and a vest on. And he just started barking orders at people. And most people just followed. In fact, I think all of them just, he asked certain people to move 6 feet away and all these things. And people just did what they were asked. Now, what's very fascinating about this, if you'd have asked those people before, if a random stranger come up to you and barked orders at you, would you follow them? I guarantee to a T, they would all say no. So you've got this real disconnect with what actually is running in the GPS. Because it's outside of awareness, it takes us down lots of behaviors and avenues that we wouldn't go down if we knew or was conscious. And that's certainly what's happened to a lot of us over, however people have become aware, that we stop following things because now we're conscious that they don't make any sense and they're actually going the wrong way. And that's really the power of becoming conscious of what's in the GPS. The stuff that's actually denied or repressed, a lot of that's the shadow. And that will be things where we program certain behaviors, but we actually don't like them. So we repress them and we hide them out. And some of the shadow work can be actually really powerful. So of course, so many people is outside their awareness. They're actually just compliant. They just want to comply with things. It's very much a natural thing in humans to just be agreeable. But I think we need to discern and have a lot more questioning going on. And it's really been too many people's sort of pushover nature that's been exploited for far too long. So in summary, really, hopefully now this metaphor, and that was 10, and I could have done probably 100 on how we can really understand behavior with this metaphor. But what we have is the vehicle of the mind is really the thinker, the animal, and the GPS. How often we stay in the thinker is very key. When the animal kicks in, we're going to be very emotional, very reactive. We're not going to be very rational. And of course, the GPS is absolutely essential because both the thinker and the animal are acting to what's in the GPS. The GPS would have been programmed from our conditioning, our education, all the movies we watch, all the documentaries we watch. That's where we get all that information. If someone's studying medical literature and reading studies, they're probably going to have a more accurate, understand of certain things than say the BBC, which is just going to be promoting certain propaganda. Number two, it's impossible to rationalize with someone when the animal is driving. This is why it's so key to understand this, because how many times have we tried to throw a fact at someone that's in an emotional state? It will have zero effect. It's really key to understand that most behavior is automatic. That's why it's really key to take control of our own GPS. And can we now see how the GPS is the essential piece? This is what is targeted with conditioning, programming, and propaganda. It's really to update what people think to be true. This is how we operate and where we get our information from to behave. So just a quick piece on solutions, because I think when you really do understand this at a deeper level, you can actually start to really design solutions that will work. Trying to have a conscious conversation with someone will be largely pointless because they won't remember much of it. If you don't use certain language or stories that will impact them at a deeper level, they're just going to have an interesting conversation, walk off and forget about it 10 minutes later. So possible solutions, I think it's really key that communicating with the GPS is really this talking to the unconscious mind. Is we have to navigate that animal of the unconscious, and then stories, metaphor, and artful questions is really what starts to update that GPS. It goes to Christmas future, and this really is taken from Scrooge. And if we are able to show people what life's going to be like, not just by telling them, but by showing them. If you could get some very good documentary makers, filmmakers, and they could create scenes of what life will be like in 2030 if certain people have their own way, people will then have an experience, and that will really start to shift them. When you look at people that are in certain movements and campaigns, there was usually an experience that they had that prompted them to drive them. And we've really got to give people experiences rather than data. The data is key to get into the GPS, but it's experiences that do that. Raw data doesn't tend to get that deep into them. And of course, there's many solutions to work with our own GPS. I mean, I like the Sedona, EFT, Letting Go, and many others. I certainly spend a lot of time understanding myself and how it's very important that once we get the GPS going the right way, we don't have to put so much effort in because it would just be a natural movement. So hopefully that was very useful, because I think this metaphor has been very powerful for me in understanding behavior at a lot deeper level, and it really does avoid wasting a lot of time with things that don't work. If you do like to support the project, you can donate at this location. Coaching and perception work is now available. If you want to work with the GPS, you could find any sort of EFT or Sedona coach or read any of the books yourself. We also supply it if need be. And I'm going to open out for Q&A.